He thought he was ready for anything. After all, Daniel had survived the front lines, where every day was a fight for survival. But nothing could prepare him for what waited at home. The small town, the place he had dreamed of returning to, now felt unfamiliar, almost like a stranger. He walked the same streets he'd grown up on, the weight of his uniform heavy on his shoulders, but something was wrong, he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. And when the neighbor finally told him the truth, it hit harder than any battle he'd faced. His world, once filled with hope and anticipation, crumbled in an instant. The life he had fought for was gone, replaced by a heartbreaking reality he never saw coming. Daniel stepped off the bus, his uniform worn, the creases of time and war etched into his face. He wasn't the same young man who had left home, eager to serve his country. As he walked through the familiar streets of his small town, everything felt foreign, like it had aged without him. The smell of cut grass and the quiet hum of cars passing by seemed almost nostalgic, but there was a tension in the air, something unsettling. His mind drifted between memories of home and the battles he had left behind, a weight hanging over him that he couldn't quite shake. The road stretched ahead, and with each step, he grew more eager yet apprehensive about what awaited him. The thought of his family, his brothers, and especially his mother filled him with hope. He pictured her in the kitchen, her hands busy with some meal as she hummed quietly to herself. He longed for that comfort, that safety, after all the chaos he'd been through. He thought about Sarah, his girlfriend. Their last conversation had been filled with promises of a future, of family, of chasing the American dream together. His heart pounded as he approached his childhood home, expecting to see her smiling face, his brothers running up to him, and his mother's warm embrace. But as he neared the front yard, something didn't feel right. A neighbor stood by the fence, his face heavy with something Daniel couldn't yet comprehend. "Dan," he began, hesitating, as if the words weighed too much to carry. Daniel stopped, his heart racing as if in battle again. The neighbor's eyes met his, filled with an unspoken sorrow. "I don't know how to say this," he started again, voice cracking, "but you need to know before you walk through that door." Time seemed to stop for a moment. The streets, the cars, the world, all faded as Daniel felt an invisible hand grip his chest, pulling him into a place darker than any battlefield he had known. He could barely hear what came next, but he didn't need to. The look in the man's eyes, the way his voice faltered, it was enough. Daniel's body tensed, and without realizing it, he was holding his breath. His mind was racing, trying to reject the truth that was about to hit him. He forced a step forward, then another, his legs heavy as if wading through water. Whatever the news, it was worse than anything he had prepared himself for. He swallowed hard, bracing for the impact. When the neighbor finally spoke, the words pierced through him, shattering the fragile hope he had been clinging to. "Your mother's gone, Daniel. She passed while you were overseas." The world tilted, the ground shifted beneath him, and suddenly, the weight of everything he had been holding inside crashed over him like a wave. He stood there, unable to move, his mind struggling to process the reality of it. The one person who had been his constant, his anchor in a world of uncertainty, was gone. Daniel stood frozen, the neighbor's words echoing in his mind. His mother was gone, and nothing he could do would ever change that. Guilt washed over him, mixing with shock and pain. How could this have happened while he was away? He hadn't even been there to say goodbye, to tell her one last time how much she meant to him. His younger brothers were now depending on him, looking up to him for strength, but all he felt was emptiness. The family he had come back to protect had already been broken, and he wasn't there to fix it. When he finally walked through the door of his house, the air was thick with silence, a haunting reminder of her absence. His brothers, still just boys, stared at him with wide, tear-streaked eyes, searching for reassurance he wasn't sure he could give. How could he lead them when he could barely keep himself together? The weight of his mother's absence pressed down on him, an invisible force squeezing the breath from his lungs. Every memory of her, every laugh, every piece of advice she'd ever given him played on repeat in his mind, driving the loss deeper into his heart. The funeral had been a small, somber affair, but the real struggle began afterward. The house, once filled with warmth and life, now felt cold and unfamiliar. His mother had been the glue that held everything together, and without her, the cracks were starting to show. Daniel knew he had to step up, had to be the man his brothers needed, but the grief was all-consuming. Every corner of the house reminded him of her, her laughter in the kitchen, the soft hum of her voice as she worked, the way she'd always known just how to soothe his worries. Now, those memories only deepened his pain. Late at night, when his brothers were asleep, Daniel would sit alone, staring at the old photographs of his mother, trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't help but feel like he had failed her, like his duty to his country had come at the cost of the one person who had been his greatest ally. He had always been her protector, her soldier, and now she was gone, leaving him to pick up the pieces of their shattered family. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, but he knew there was no escaping it. His brothers were looking to him for leadership, and he couldn't let them down. And so, despite the ache in his heart, Daniel pushed forward. He had no choice. His mother may have been gone, but her lessons remained. She had always taught him to be strong, to take care of those he loved, and now, more than ever, he had to honor that. He had to be the man she had raised him to be, even if it meant burying his own pain deep inside. He would take care of his brothers, just as she would have wanted. But inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that his return home, the one he had dreamed of, had turned into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Just as Daniel thought he had reached his limit, the weight of his mother's death pressing on him, life threw him yet another curveball. One evening, after helping his brothers settle down for bed, Sarah showed up at his doorstep. There was something different about her, an air of hesitation, as if she was carrying a secret too heavy to bear alone. He invited her inside, hoping for a brief moment of comfort, but instead, she dropped a bombshell that left him reeling. She was pregnant. For a moment, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the silver lining he needed, a new life amidst all this loss. But her next words hit him like a punch in the gut. She wasn't sure if the baby was his. Everything went silent. The room seemed to spin as Daniel tried to make sense of her confession. How could this be happening now, after everything? His mind raced back to the promises they'd made, the dreams they'd shared about building a future together, the American dream of a house, a family, stability. But now, that dream felt distant and uncertain, tainted by doubt. He wanted to believe her, to trust that their love had been strong enough to survive the distance, but the questions gnawed at him. Was she telling the truth? Had someone else stepped into his place while he was away? Daniel's emotions were a whirlwind, hurt, anger, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. He had always been faithful to Sarah, even in the darkest moments of his deployment when the loneliness threatened to consume him. He had clung to the thought of her, of coming home to her, as a lifeline. But now, everything was uncertain. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she fumbled over her words, trying to explain herself. Part of him wanted to scream, to demand answers, but another part of him was too exhausted, too broken by everything that had happened in the last few weeks to even begin to fight. The next few days were a blur of avoidance. Daniel found reasons to stay away from Sarah, burying himself in work and his responsibilities at home. His mind raced with questions, but he didn't have the energy to confront her, not yet. Every time he thought about the baby, he felt a strange mix of emotions, hope for the possibility that it was his, fear of the unknown, and a deep sadness for the relationship that now seemed so fragile. He knew he couldn't ignore it forever, but for now, he focused on his brothers, trying to distract himself from the storm brewing inside him. As much as he tried to push it aside, the reality of the situation crept into his thoughts at night. The idea of becoming a father terrified him. Was he ready for that kind of responsibility? Could he handle it with everything else already on his plate? And if the baby wasn't his, what then? Would he be able to look past it and still build a life with Sarah, or would it be the final blow to their relationship? The weight of it all was suffocating, but somewhere deep inside, Daniel still held on to a sliver of hope, a belief that maybe things could still work out, that maybe, just maybe, the baby was his. With everything spiraling around him, Daniel knew he didn't have the luxury of falling apart. His brothers needed him, and they became his first priority. He had no choice but to put his personal pain on the back burner and focus on their well-being. The responsibility weighed heavy on him, but it was also the only thing that kept him going. Day after day, he took on the role of caretaker, making sure they were fed, helping them with school, and doing whatever odd jobs he could find to keep the household running. It wasn't easy, but it gave him a sense of purpose, something to hold on to amidst the chaos. The struggle became his constant companion. Financial pressures mounted as the bills piled up, and Daniel was forced to take on any job he could find. From working at the local market to fixing cars in the neighborhood, he did whatever it took to keep things afloat. Sleepless nights became routine as he juggled the demands of being both a brother and a father figure. He often found himself standing outside the apartment, staring up at the sky, wondering how he was going to keep it all together. Yet, despite the exhaustion, there was a fire inside him that refused to be extinguished. He had survived the battlefield, he could survive this. Sarah tried to reach out during this time, but Daniel kept his distance. The uncertainty surrounding her pregnancy still loomed large in his mind, and the emotional distance between them grew wider with each passing day. He wasn't ready to face that storm yet. For now, his focus was on his brothers, on keeping them safe and ensuring they had a stable home. But the weight of his unresolved relationship with Sarah hung in the air, a silent burden that he carried with him everywhere. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever, but for now, it was one more thing he couldn't afford to deal with. As time went on, Daniel's brothers began to notice the strain he was under. They watched him, quietly absorbing the sacrifices he made for them. It wasn't lost on them how hard he worked, how much he gave up to make sure they were okay. They admired him, even if they didn't always say it out loud. But Daniel, caught in the grind of day-to-day survival, often felt like he was failing them. Every missed opportunity to spend time with them, every moment of frustration, felt like a crack in the foundation of the family he was trying so hard to hold together. Despite the hardship, Daniel pressed on. He had no other choice. His brothers depended on him, and though the weight of responsibility was crushing at times, it was also what kept him moving forward. There were moments, late at night, when he questioned whether he was doing enough, whether he could ever live up to the expectations his mother had set. But in those moments of doubt, he reminded himself of one simple truth: he was doing his best. And for now, that had to be enough. The question of paternity hung over Daniel like a storm cloud that refused to break. It was always there, casting a shadow over every interaction he had with Sarah. The uncertainty made it impossible for him to feel close to her, and he found himself pulling away more and more. Each time she reached out, he recoiled, afraid of what he might feel, afraid of the truth. The idea of raising another man's child gnawed at him, creating a distance between them that felt insurmountable. He avoided her as much as he could, not ready to face what might come if the baby wasn't his. In the quiet moments, when he wasn't buried in work or taking care of his brothers, his mind wandered back to his time in the army. The discipline, the loyalty to his comrades, the lessons of never abandoning those you care about, all of it played on repeat in his mind. He had fought for others, risked his life to protect people he barely knew. And yet, here he was, running away from the woman he loved, uncertain if he could handle the truth. The guilt of that realization ate at him, slowly wearing down the walls he had built around his heart. Eventually, Daniel couldn't avoid it any longer. He knew he had to confront the situation head-on, for his sake and for Sarah's. The uncertainty was tearing them both apart, and no matter what the outcome, they needed answers. One evening, he found himself standing outside her apartment, his hands clenched into fists, his heart racing. He had faced worse than this in battle, but somehow, this felt harder. When she opened the door, the vulnerability in her eyes was enough to break through his defenses. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but Daniel knew what he had to say. They sat down and had the conversation they had both been avoiding. The emotions were raw, the pain evident in both their voices, but for the first time in a long time, they were honest with each other. Sarah explained her uncertainty, her fear, and the regret she felt for not telling him sooner. And Daniel, despite the anger and confusion, found himself softening, realizing that beneath it all, he still loved her. The tension slowly eased as they shared their fears, their hopes, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. But the question remained unanswered, and they both knew that the only way forward was to find out the truth. Daniel wasn't ready to let go, but he also wasn't ready to fully embrace the idea of fatherhood until he knew for sure. They agreed to take a paternity test, and in the days that followed, Daniel's emotions were a tangled mess of hope and fear. It was out of his hands now, but no matter the result, he knew one thing for sure: the love he felt for Sarah and the bond they shared wasn't something he could easily walk away from. The day the test results came back felt like a turning point in Daniel's life. His heart pounded as he opened the envelope, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. He had braced himself for either outcome, but deep down, he knew which one he wanted. He needed this child to be his, needed it to be the answer to all the doubts that had plagued him. As his eyes scanned the results, relief washed over him like a wave. He was the father. In that moment, all the uncertainty, all the fear, melted away, replaced by a deep sense of joy and purpose. Daniel rushed to Sarah's apartment, eager to share the news. When she opened the door, her face was a mixture of apprehension and hope. Without saying a word, he pulled her into a tight embrace, the weight of the last few weeks lifting off their shoulders. "It's ours," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The tears in her eyes mirrored his own, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were on the same page. The love they had for each other was still there, stronger than the doubts that had threatened to tear them apart. This was their chance to start over. Their conversation that night was full of hope and healing. They talked about their future, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, and how they would build a life together. For Daniel, the news of being a father wasn't just a relief, it reignited something inside him that had been lost. His sense of purpose, his drive to create something better for his family, came rushing back. He realized that this child, their child, was the start of something new. It was no longer about just surviving, it was about thriving, about giving his family the life they deserved. With the paternity confirmed, Daniel's relationship with Sarah took on a new sense of clarity. The doubts and distance were replaced by determination. He was going to be there for her, for their child, and for his brothers. The future that had once seemed so bleak now shimmered with possibility. It wasn't going to be easy, Daniel knew that. But after everything they had been through, he was ready to fight for it. Together, they started planning for the baby, sharing dreams about the family they would build, the house they would turn into a home, and the life they would create for their child. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself more motivated than ever. He had always been a fighter, but now he had something real to fight for, a family. The sense of purpose that had carried him through his time in the army was now directed toward this new chapter of his life. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was a father, a provider, and a man determined to build a future. As he looked into the mirror one morning, he barely recognized the man staring back. He had been through hell and back, but standing on the other side, he knew he was stronger for it. With the weight of doubt lifted and a newfound sense of clarity, Daniel began to think about what the future could hold. The child growing inside Sarah became his motivation, his reason to keep pushing forward. He had always dreamed of giving his family the kind of life they deserved, a life full of stability and opportunities. Now, that dream felt more real than ever. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the skills he'd honed in the army, discipline, leadership, and problem-solving, would guide him through. He wasn't just building a future for himself anymore, he was building it for his brothers, Sarah, and their baby. Daniel quickly realized that to provide the life he wanted for his family, he needed to think bigger. The odd jobs weren't going to cut it forever. His mind turned toward entrepreneurship, an idea that had been quietly simmering ever since his return. He thought back to the times he'd spent with his mother, learning how to fix things around the house, how to hustle and make ends meet. Those moments, though simple, were seeds of inspiration. Maybe he could start something of his own, something rooted in those early lessons. It was time to take a risk. The idea for his business came slowly, piece by piece. At first, it was just a vague concept, maybe something in construction or mechanics, areas where he had experience. But as he began to sketch out plans and talk to a few trusted friends, the vision started to take shape. He wanted to create something that would not only provide for his family but also leave a legacy, something his brothers could one day be a part of. It wasn't just about making money, it was about building something lasting, something that reflected the values his mother had instilled in him. Sarah stood by his side, offering her support at every turn. Though the financial pressures were still very real, they faced them together. There were late nights spent poring over business ideas, brainstorming ways to get the project off the ground. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of moments when Daniel felt like giving up. But every time he thought about his family, the future he wanted for his brothers and his soon-to-be child, he pushed forward. It was as if every sacrifice he had made, every struggle he had endured, was preparing him for this moment. Slowly but surely, the business started to grow. It wasn't an overnight success, but with each small win, Daniel's confidence grew. He had found his calling, something that gave him the same sense of purpose he had felt in the army, but now it was even more personal. His brothers pitched in when they could, learning from him as he had once learned from their mother. They weren't just a family surviving the world's hardships anymore, they were building something together, creating a foundation for a future full of promise. The American dream, once distant, now felt within reach. As Daniel's business grew, so did his determination to make it something extraordinary. The small, humble start he had envisioned began to expand beyond what he'd imagined. Each day was filled with new challenges, but he faced them with the same tenacity that had gotten him through the hardest moments of his life. Slowly, word spread about the quality of his work and his dedication to his customers. It wasn't just about making money, it was about building a reputation, one that would reflect the values his mother had instilled in him. With each job completed, his confidence grew, and so did the business. His brothers were there every step of the way, helping out where they could, learning the ropes of the trade, and growing alongside him. Daniel couldn't help but feel proud of the young men they were becoming. They weren't just boys looking to him for guidance anymore, they were part of the team, contributing to the family's success. He often thought about how far they had all come, from those early days of grief and uncertainty to now, building something together. The bond they shared, strengthened through hardship, was one of the greatest rewards of this journey. But the success wasn't immediate or without sacrifice. There were long days and even longer nights, moments when the stress of keeping the business afloat seemed overwhelming. The market was competitive, and there were times when Daniel questioned if he could keep up. But every time doubt crept in, he thought about his brothers, his child, and Sarah, the family he was working so hard to provide for. That thought alone was enough to fuel him through the toughest of days. He had come too far to turn back now. This was the life he was fighting for, and he wasn't going to give up. As the business continued to thrive, Daniel's role evolved from being just a worker to a leader. He hired more people, expanded his operations, and even started mentoring others who were trying to start their own businesses. His success wasn't just about the money, it was about creating opportunities, both for his family and for others who were struggling to find their path. The sense of pride he felt when he looked around at what he had built was overwhelming. This wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of everything he had overcome, of the hard work and sacrifice that had gone into creating a better future. Through all the ups and downs, Sarah remained his steadfast partner. They had weathered so many storms together, and now, standing on the other side of it all, they had a stronger relationship than ever. The child they had worried so much about was now the light of their lives, a constant reminder of what they had fought for. As Daniel's business continued to grow, so did his family's sense of security and happiness. What had once felt like a distant dream was now their reality, built on a foundation of hard work, love, and resilience. As the years passed and Daniel's business flourished into a successful enterprise, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The pain of losing his mother still lingered, but it had transformed into something else, an unspoken force that had pushed him to become the man she would have been proud of. He realized that her death, while devastating, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Without that loss, he might never have found the strength to take on the responsibilities that had shaped him. Now, with his business thriving and his family by his side, he saw that hardship had, in its own way, been a gift. One day, as Daniel looked out at the success he had built, the memories of his mother came flooding back. Her wisdom, her kindness, her unwavering belief in him, they were all still with him, guiding him even though she was gone. He decided it was time to honor her in a way that went beyond just memories. He took a portion of the wealth he had accumulated and started a charity in her name, something that would give back to the community the way she had always done. It was his way of making sure her legacy lived on, not just in him, but in the lives of others. The act of starting the charity brought a sense of closure and healing that Daniel hadn't realized he needed. It wasn't just about the money or the success anymore, it was about honoring the journey that had brought him here. Every step, every struggle, every moment of doubt had led to this point. And now, he had the chance to give back, to help others in ways he wished he could have helped his mother. The healing wasn't immediate, but with every life the charity touched, with every person who benefited from his efforts, he felt a little more peace. His brothers, now grown men, stood beside him, just as they had during those early, difficult days. They had found their own paths, their own successes, inspired by the example Daniel had set. Each of them carried their mother's spirit within them, and they too contributed to the charity, ensuring that her legacy would be carried forward for generations to come. They were no longer just the boys Daniel had once struggled to care for, they were his partners, his equals, and together, they were making a difference in the world. The bond between them had only grown stronger with time, a testament to the family they had worked so hard to keep together. As Daniel watched his brothers thrive, his business grow, and his family flourish, he felt a sense of redemption that was hard to put into words. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into something powerful, something that gave him the strength to continue moving forward. In those quiet moments of reflection, he understood that the hardships he had faced were never meant to break him, they were meant to shape him into the man he had become. His mother's loss, Sarah's uncertainty, the burden of responsibility, they had all been part of the path to this moment of healing and fulfillment. Years later, as Daniel sat on the porch of his newly built house, he reflected on the life he had created. It was everything he had once dreamed of, and more. His brothers were thriving in their own lives, having followed their passions and found success in their own right. The family bond they shared remained unbreakable, forged in the fires of their early struggles. Sarah sat beside him, their child playing in the yard. The laughter of his family filled the air, a constant reminder of how far they had come. Daniel couldn't help but smile, knowing that this life, this beautiful, fulfilled life, was something he had fought hard to build. The house, once just a distant dream, now stood as a symbol of everything Daniel had overcome. It wasn't just a roof over their heads, it was a home filled with love, warmth, and memories. He had built this life from the ground up, using the wealth he had earned through hard work and determination. The apartment they had struggled to hold on to was now a distant memory, replaced by this spacious home, where his family could grow and thrive. It wasn't just about the material success, it was about the stability and love that filled every corner of their lives. Daniel often thought about how far he had come since the day he returned from the army. Back then, he had been weighed down by loss, uncertainty, and the overwhelming burden of responsibility. But now, he stood tall, proud of the man he had become. His journey had been filled with hardship and pain, but those experiences had only strengthened him. He had turned those struggles into opportunities, creating a life of wealth, stability, and love. The American dream, which had once seemed so out of reach, was now his reality, a reality he had earned through resilience and perseverance. His child, now old enough to understand the world, often asked him about his past, about the road that had led them to this beautiful life. Daniel shared those stories with a sense of pride, knowing that every moment of doubt, every challenge, had been worth it. He wanted his child to understand that life wasn't always easy, but with enough determination, love, and hard work, anything was possible. As he shared those lessons, he hoped they would carry the same values into the future, ensuring that the family's legacy of resilience would live on. As the sun set over the horizon, Daniel's heart swelled with gratitude. He had built something lasting, not just for himself, but for his entire family. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every sacrifice. He had learned that true wealth wasn't just about money, it was about the love and connection shared with those closest to him. And now, surrounded by the people he loved most, Daniel knew that the future was bright. He had created a life filled with hope, love, and purpose, a life that would stand the test of time, just like the family who had helped him build it. Have you ever wondered what you would do if your world changed in an instant? If everything you thought you knew was taken from you? Daniel's story shows us the power of resilience, love, and the strength to keep moving forward, even when the path ahead seems impossible. What would you have done in his shoes? Could you have faced the weight of responsibility, the doubts, and the hardships that he did? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this journey of redemption and healing. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this. There's so much more to come, and I can't wait to share it with you.